The courtroom was alive with its usual energy. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered hurried last-minute advice to clients, and adjusted their ties. Spectators filled the gallery, leaning forward in anticipation of the day's proceedings. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the tension that seemed to hang over every trial. Judge Eleanor Hayes adjusted her robe as she took her seat at the bench, her expression as composed as ever. She glanced at the docket in front of her, noting the case scheduled to begin. The State of Louisiana versus James Anderson. A laundry list of charges followed: robbery, assault, and resisting arrest. It looked routine enough. Eleanor sighed softly, pressing her lips together in a thin line. It was always the same story. Another defendant tangled in the system, another life teetering on the edge. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice booming. "All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Hayes presiding." The room rose as one, the shuffling of feet echoing like a wave. Eleanor nodded, motioning for everyone to sit. "Bring in the defendant," the bailiff commanded, his tone firm and authoritative. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and two officers escorted the defendant inside. Eleanor barely looked up as she made notes on her docket, her pen scratching faintly against the paper. But when she did glance up, her hand froze mid-motion. The man walking toward the defendant's table, shackled and weary, was someone she hadn't seen in decades, someone she never expected to see again. Her throat tightened as recognition struck her like a thunderbolt. "James?" she whispered, so quietly that no one else heard. He looked older, his shoulders hunched as though carrying the weight of a lifetime of troubles. His face was gaunt, lined with deep creases that told stories of hardship. But it was his eyes, the same piercing brown eyes she'd known as a child, that held her captive. James Anderson. The long-forgotten memories crashed into her like a storm. Long summer days spent racing their bikes through dirt trails. The two of them sitting on the edge of the creek, legs dangling into the water, dreaming about all the places they'd go when they grew up. Nights spent catching fireflies under the sprawling magnolia tree in her backyard. Eleanor's chest tightened. That boy, her childhood best friend, now stood before her, an accused criminal. James's gaze flickered toward her, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Recognition bloomed in his expression, followed swiftly by a shadow of something darker, shame perhaps. He quickly looked away, his shoulders tensing as if he were bracing for impact. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. She was a judge, a professional. Her duty demanded impartiality, but her heart was pounding in her chest, a steady drumbeat of confusion and disbelief. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice faltering slightly before she steadied it, "you stand accused of robbery and assault. How do you plead?" James lifted his head, his voice low but firm. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Eleanor swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the gavel. She gave a slight nod and gestured for the prosecutor to proceed. "This is not happening," she told herself. "Focus on the case. Focus on the facts." Eleanor's mind drifted back to the first time she had met James. She had been 8 years old, wandering further from home than she was supposed to, when she stumbled upon him fishing at the creek. "What you doing?" she'd asked, startling him. James, a wiry boy with a mop of unruly curls, had looked up, his fishing rod tangled in the reeds. "Trying to catch dinner," he'd said, grinning despite his obvious frustration. "You're terrible at it," she teased, plopping down beside him. "Yeah? You think you can do better?" She had laughed, grabbing the rod from his hands and deftly untangling the line. It was the beginning of a friendship that would define their childhoods. Despite the unspoken rules of their small, segregated town, Eleanor and James had carved out a world of their own. They spent hours exploring the woods, inventing secret codes, and dreaming of adventures far beyond Hammond, Louisiana. But the world outside their bubble was unrelenting. Eleanor's father, a strict and imposing man, had caught them together one evening. "Eleanor," he had barked, his tone cold and sharp. "Get inside! Now!" She had hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place, his expression unreadable. "Go on," James had whispered. "It's fine." But it hadn't been fine. The next day, James stopped coming around, and soon after, Eleanor's family moved away. She never saw him again, until now. The prosecutor's voice snapped Eleanor back to the present. This case, he was saying, is about violence and disregard for the law. The evidence will show that James Anderson acted with intent and malice. Eleanor tried to focus on his words, but her gaze kept drifting to James. He sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. His defense attorney, a young woman with a calm but commanding presence, leaned over to whisper something in his ear. He nodded slightly but didn't respond. Eleanor forced herself to sit straighter. She couldn't let her emotions interfere with her role. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "we will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of these charges." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Powell. Ms. Porter, you may proceed with your opening statement." The defense attorney rose, her demeanor calm and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice measured, "the prosecution would have you believe this is a straightforward case, that my client is guilty because the evidence suggests it. But I urge you to look beyond the surface. Sometimes things aren't as simple as they appear." Eleanor listened carefully, grateful for the distraction of Porter's argument. But the tension in her chest remained. When the recess was called, Eleanor retreated to her chambers, closing the door behind her with a shaky exhale. She leaned against the desk, her mind racing. How was she supposed to navigate this? Her past and her present were colliding in ways she could never have anticipated. Could she genuinely remain impartial? The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The weight of the previous day sat heavily on her shoulders. She spent the night turning over every detail of the trial in her mind. Sleep had evaded her, and every time she closed her eyes, memories of James and their shared childhood filled the darkness. As she unlocked her chambers and settled at her desk, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Her clerk Melinda stepped in, holding a stack of papers. "Morning, Judge Hayes. I just wanted to drop off the updated docket and, remind you about the Anderson case. It's first on the schedule today." Eleanor nodded, gesturing for Melinda to set the papers on the desk. "Anything else?" Eleanor asked, trying to mask her unease. Melinda hesitated. "You okay, Judge? You seemed a bit distracted yesterday." Eleanor forced a small smile. "I'm fine, Melinda. Just a long day." Melinda didn't look convinced, but she nodded and left without pressing further. Alone again, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She knew she needed to compartmentalize. Whatever personal history she had with James couldn't influence her decisions in the courtroom. Still, the thought of presiding over this case unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. When court resumed, the gallery was more crowded than the previous day. Word had spread about the case, and a few reporters lingered at the back. Eleanor scanned the room briefly before her gaze landed on James. He looked calmer today, though his posture was still guarded. He met her eyes for the briefest moment, then looked away. Eleanor tightened her grip on the gavel. "Mr. Powell," she said, addressing the prosecutor, "you may call your first witness." The prosecutor called a shop owner who claimed to have witnessed the alleged robbery. The man, a wiry, middle-aged figure with sharp features, took the stand and adjusted his tie nervously. "State your name for the record," Powell instructed. "Samuel Dillard," the man replied, his voice shaky. "And can you tell the court what you saw on the night of November 12th? Dillard recounted his version of events, describing a man he claimed matched James's description entering his store, demanding money, and fleeing before the police arrived. Eleanor watched James's reaction carefully. He sat motionless, his face a mask of neutrality, but she noticed his hands fidgeting slightly, a telltale sign of anxiety. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Ms. Porter rose with a measured confidence. "Mr. Dillard," she began, her tone polite but firm, "you stated that the individual who entered your store was wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Is that correct?" "Yes," Dillard replied. "And you didn't see his face clearly, did you?" "Well, no," Dillard admitted, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Porter continued. "So your identification of my client is based solely on his height and build?" Dillard hesitated. I suppose so. No further questions, Your Honor, Porter said, returning to her seat. Eleanor made a note on her docket. The prosecution's case seemed circumstantial at best, but it wasn't her place to make judgments yet. As the trial continued, Eleanor found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. During a break, she stood at the window of her chambers, staring out at the bustling street below. Her mind wandered back to the last time she had seen James, before their families had been forced apart. It was a summer evening, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. They had met at their favorite spot by the creek, their laughter echoing through the woods. "One day, we're going to leave this town," James had said, skipping a rock across the water. Eleanor had smiled, her heart full of dreams. "Promise me we'll always stick together." "I promise," James had replied without hesitation. But life had other plans. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. She had moved on, pursued her education, and built a successful career. She hadn't thought about James in years, yet here he was, his life a stark contrast to hers. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor prepared to head home, she spotted James in the hallway. He was being escorted back to the holding area by two officers, but for a brief moment, their paths crossed. "James," she said quietly, surprising even herself. The officers stopped, glancing at her uncertainly. James turned, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Your Honor," one of the officers said. "Is there a problem?" Eleanor shook her head quickly. "No, carry on." But before they could lead James away, she added, "Mr. Anderson, I'd like to see you in my chambers tomorrow morning. Alone." James's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice subdued. As Eleanor walked away, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was treading a fine line, but she needed answers. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at her chambers with a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts were clouded with questions she didn't know how to ask. Why had James ended up here, accused of a crime? What had gone so wrong in his life? And why did she feel personally responsible? She glanced at the clock. It was almost time. She had instructed her clerk to ensure they wouldn't be disturbed and requested that James be escorted in without shackles. An unusual request, but one she insisted on. A light knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she said, trying to steady her voice. The door opened, and James stepped in, his posture rigid. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides, as if he wasn't sure what to do with them. "You wanted to see me, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice guarded. Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit." James hesitated, then complied, lowering himself into the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and years of separation. Finally, Eleanor broke the tension. "James," she began, her tone softer than it had been in the courtroom. "I'm not speaking to you as a judge right now, just as Eleanor." James's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across his face. "Eleanor, huh? Been a long time since I heard you say your name like that." She smiled faintly. "It's been a long time, period." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So, why am I here? To reminisce about the good old days?" Eleanor sighed, folding her hands on the desk. "I just need to understand. What happened to you, James? The last time I saw you, you were talking about going to college, starting a business. And now, this?" James let out a bitter laugh. "This? You mean being hauled into court like a criminal?" She nodded. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean." James shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Life happened, Eleanor. That's what. Not everyone gets a ticket out like you did." Eleanor frowned. "A ticket out? James, you could have—" "Could have what?" he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Followed in your footsteps? Gone to law school? Built a shiny career? You don't know what it was like after you left." She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself. He was right. She didn't know. "You remember what it was like growing up?" James continued, his tone softer now, but still laced with pain. "The empty fridge, the eviction notices, Mom working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, And when she got sick, he paused, swallowing hard. Eleanor's heart clenched. She had heard about James's mother passing, but by then she was already in college, too far away to do anything. I tried to hold it together, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there's only so much a kid can do. I dropped out of school to take care of her. I worked whatever jobs I could find. And when she was gone, he trailed off, his jaw tightening. I didn't know, Eleanor said softly. Of course you didn't, James snapped, then immediately looked regretful. Sorry, that wasn't fair. She shook her head. No, it's okay. I should have reached out. I thought you were fine. You always seemed so strong. James laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, well, strength only gets you so far. After Mom died, I got caught up with some people I shouldn't have. Made some bad decisions. Spent a few years trying to dig myself out, but here I am. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, struggling to process everything James had just said. She felt a pang of guilt deep in her chest. While she had been climbing the ladder of success, James had been fighting just to survive. I'm sorry, she said finally. I wish I had known. I would have— Done what? James interrupted, his tone not unkind but firm. Sent money? Written letters? You had your own life to live, Eleanor. I don't blame you for that. But I blame myself, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. James looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. You don't need to. What's done is done. I'm just trying to get through this mess now. Eleanor nodded, wiping at the corner of her eye discreetly. About this case. James tensed. What about it? Did you do it? She asked bluntly, meeting his gaze head-on. For a moment, James said nothing. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. No, he said firmly. I didn't. But that doesn't matter, does it? I've got a record. The jury will look at me and see a guy who's already messed up before. That's all they'll need. Eleanor felt a surge of anger, not at James, but at the system that seemed so eager to discard people like him. It does matter, she said, her voice firm. And as long as you're in my courtroom, you'll get a fair trial. I promise you that. James smirked faintly. Promises don't mean much these days, but thanks, I guess. After James was escorted back to the holding area, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers, staring at the pile of case files on her desk. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just as a judge, but as someone who had once called James her best friend. She knew she couldn't let her personal feelings interfere with her duties, but she also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the system had failed him. Not this time, she muttered to herself, her jaw set with determination. The trial resumed with a tense energy filling the courtroom. Eleanor took her place at the bench, maintaining her usual authoritative demeanor, though the conversation with James lingered in her mind. She couldn't allow herself to be swayed emotionally, not when the stakes were this high. The prosecution called its next witness, a local store owner who claimed to have seen James at the scene of the crime. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Reynolds, began his questioning with practiced confidence. Mr. Carson, you testified that you saw the defendant James Russell near your store on the evening of May 14th, is that correct? The witness nodded. Yes, that's correct. And what exactly did you see? Carson cleared his throat. Well, I was closing up for the night when I noticed him hanging around near the back alley. It looked suspicious, so I kept an eye on him. Suspicious how? Reynolds pressed. He was pacing, looking around like he didn't want to be seen. Then he disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, I heard shouting and saw the commotion down the street. Reynolds turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant was not only near the scene of the crime, but was behaving in a manner consistent with someone preparing to commit it. He faced Carson again. Thank you. No further questions. James's defense attorney, a young but scrappy lawyer named Maya Patel, stood and approached the witness stand. She adjusted her glasses and smiled politely at Carson. Mr. Carson, she began, you said you saw my client pacing near your store. How far away were you? Carson frowned. Maybe 20, 30 feet? And it was nighttime, correct? Yes. Maya nodded. So it was dark, and you were 30 feet away. How can you be certain it was Mr. Russell you saw? Carson shifted uncomfortably. I got a good look at him. The streetlight was on. One streetlight, Maya repeated. Did you see his face clearly, or was it more of a general impression? I saw enough to know it was him, Carson insisted, his tone defensive. Enough, Maya echoed thoughtfully. Mr. Carson, are you aware that my client is 6 feet tall and has a noticeable limp from an old injury? Carson blinked. No, I didn't know that. Maya stepped closer. Did the person you saw have a limp? I don't remember, Carson admitted reluctantly. Maya smiled again, this time with a hint of triumph. Thank you, Mr. Carson. No further questions. Eleanor watched the exchange carefully, her expression neutral. Maya's questioning had been effective, casting doubt on the witness's reliability. But she also knew the prosecution wasn't finished yet. After a brief recess, Reynolds stood again, a confident smirk on his face. Your Honor, he began, the prosecution would like to call Detective Aaron Walker to the stand. Eleanor raised an eyebrow but nodded. Proceed. Detective Walker was a seasoned officer with a reputation for being thorough. He took the stand and was sworn in, his demeanor calm and professional. Detective, Reynolds began, can you tell the court about the evidence collected at the scene? Walker nodded. We found several items of interest, including a knife with the victim's blood on it, and a glove matching the description of one reportedly worn by the suspect. Reynolds leaned forward. And were there any fingerprints on these items? Yes, Walker confirmed. The fingerprints on the knife matched those of James Russell. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's heart sank, though her face remained impassive. Reynolds turned to the jury. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Physical evidence tying the defendant directly to the crime. Maya stood quickly. Your Honor, may I cross-examine? Eleanor nodded. Proceed. Maya approached the stand, her expression calm but determined. Detective Walker, you mentioned that the knife had Mr. Russell's fingerprints on it. Were there any other prints found? Walker hesitated. There were a few partials, but they were inconclusive. Inconclusive, Maya repeated. Meaning they couldn't be definitively matched to anyone, correct? Correct, Walker admitted. Maya stepped closer. And where exactly was the knife found? In a dumpster behind the building, Walker replied. A dumpster, Maya said, raising her eyebrows. So it wasn't on my client's person or in his possession when he was arrested? No, it wasn't. Maya turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that this knife definitively ties my client to the crime. But consider this. Anyone could have placed it in that dumpster. The presence of my client's fingerprints doesn't prove he committed the crime. It only proves he touched the knife at some point. And as we've seen, other prints were present, but conveniently, they couldn't be identified. Eleanor glanced at James, who sat rigidly at the defense table, his expression unreadable. As the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor stayed back in her chambers, staring at the case files spread across her desk. The evidence against James was damning, but something about it didn't sit right with her. She thought back to their conversation, the pain in his voice, the way he had looked her in the eye and said he didn't do it. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Maya. Your Honor, she said, stepping inside. I know this is unorthodox, but I wanted to thank you for how you've handled this case so far. It means a lot to my client to have someone impartial on the bench. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. Ms. Patel, I want you to know that I take my role very seriously. Everyone deserves a fair trial, no matter what their past looks like. Maya hesitated, then said, Do you believe him? That he's innocent? Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. It's not about what I believe. It's about what the evidence proves. But as Maya left, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that James was telling the truth, and that the real story behind the crime was yet to be uncovered. The days after the dramatic courtroom revelations felt longer than any Eleanor had experienced on the bench. The defense's cross-examination had shaken the prosecution, but she knew it wasn't over yet. She had learned long ago not to underestimate the depths of legal strategy, and this trial was shaping up to be a game of moves and counter-moves that neither side could afford to lose. Eleanor spent the following morning poring over the case files in her chambers, reviewing every scrap of evidence with a meticulous eye. There were still gaps in the story, pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit neatly together. The knife, the fingerprints, the witness testimonies, all of them were circumstantial. Nothing screamed guilt definitively. Her mind kept returning to one key question. Why had James been so adamant about his innocence? Was he lying to save himself, or was there more to the story than what the evidence showed? Then a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Detective Walker, holding a thick envelope. "Your Honor," he began, setting the envelope down on her desk, "I have new information regarding the case." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "New information? From where?" "A tip," Walker said, looking uneasy. "We were able to get a hold of a security camera from a nearby business, one we hadn't noticed before. It shows the alley behind the store where the victim was attacked." Eleanor sat up straighter. "Go on." "It was recorded around the time of the incident. The footage is grainy, but—" He hesitated before continuing, clearly reluctant. "It shows someone else, not James, near the dumpster where the knife was found. We ran facial recognition and it came up with a name, Frank Miller." Eleanor's mind raced. Frank Miller was known to her. He was a local criminal with a history of violent offenses. His name had never come up in connection to the crime before. Why hadn't anyone followed up on this earlier? "This changes everything," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the rush of thoughts flooding her mind. She knew the gravity of the discovery. "I want to see that footage. Now." Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in the privacy of the courtroom's viewing room, staring at the grainy footage that could be the key to everything. The video showed a man, cloaked in a dark hoodie, moving swiftly around the back of the building. He was carrying something, a small bag perhaps, or a bundle. He paused near the dumpster, glanced around, and then quickly disappeared into the shadows. It wasn't James. It wasn't anyone who resembled him. This was someone else entirely. Eleanor watched the footage again, carefully noting every detail. There was something familiar about the figure, but she couldn't place it at first. The man moved with a particular confidence, like someone who knew the area well. Too well. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but there was no mistaking the fact that this wasn't the defendant. Her pulse quickened as she leaned in closer. "Walker!" she barked, turning to the detective standing beside her. "Who else was in the area that night? Who else had a reason to be near that dumpster?" Walker glanced at the screen and then back at Eleanor. "We'll run his name through our databases, Your Honor. I'll get back to you as soon as we have something." Eleanor didn't wait for him to leave before making her own mental connections. Frank Miller was a known associate of a few other criminals in town, people who could easily have had a motive to target the victim. But the question was, why had Miller been near the scene, and why hadn't anyone mentioned him until now? The next day, the court reconvened, and Eleanor felt the weight of the case settling on her shoulders more than ever. Maya and James were waiting at the defense table, the former with a determined look on her face, the latter still appearing calm, but with his eyes shadowed by the anxiety of the trial. As the courtroom filled with anticipation, Eleanor turned her gaze toward the prosecution team. Reynolds stood, his usual smug expression replaced by a more serious demeanor. Something was different today. She could feel it in the air. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, standing up, "the prosecution would like to call Frank Miller to the stand." The courtroom buzzed with confusion. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Frank Miller? Why was he being called now, after all this time? The timing seemed too perfect, too convenient. Miller, however, wasn't the one who entered the courtroom. Instead, Detective Walker appeared, looking agitated and hurried. He walked straight up to the bench and whispered something in Eleanor's ear. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she heard the words. "Your Honor, we've just learned that Frank Miller was found dead in his apartment. His death appears to be a suicide." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor stood frozen, trying to process the revelation. A suicide? Was it connected to the case? Was Miller trying to cover something up? She motioned for Walker to stay. "What exactly did you find?" "We haven't confirmed the cause yet, Your Honor," Walker said grimly. "But it appears to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. No signs of struggle. But When we checked his apartment, we found a box of items belonging to the victim. Identification, personal effects, and— He paused, swallowing hard. A burner phone, a number listed as EL on it. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The name EL could be a coincidence, but it could also be something much worse. Someone had used Miller as a pawn, and now that he was dead, the real player might be trying to cover their tracks. "Detective, I need you to find out more, and I need it fast." She turned to the jury, then back to the defense table. James's eyes met hers, and for the first time in the trial, she saw something. Fear, or perhaps realization, flicker in his gaze. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess," Maya said, her voice steady despite the unsettling news. Eleanor nodded. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As she retreated to her chambers, Eleanor's mind raced with the implications of Miller's death. If someone wanted to ensure the case fell apart, framing James was one way to do it. But who was pulling the strings? She stared at the files, now more fragmented than ever, unsure who she could trust. The pieces were slowly coming together, but she still felt like she was missing something crucial. Eleanor had to make a choice. Could she continue this trial knowing how many questions remained unanswered? Or was it time to bring the truth into the light, no matter how dangerous it might be? The courtroom was alive with murmurs as Eleanor took her seat once more. The recess had done little to calm her mind. In fact, the discovery of Frank Miller's death had only served to deepen the mystery surrounding the case. Who had orchestrated this web of deceit, and why had Miller been silenced just when the truth seemed within reach? Eleanor glanced across the room at James. His expression had changed. Gone was the confident facade. In its place was a man caught between fear and frustration, a man who knew that the walls were closing in on him. Maya, seated beside him, seemed determined to keep her composure, but even she couldn't hide the tension that pulsed beneath her skin. "Your Honor," Reynolds called out as the court resumed. His voice was louder than usual, as if he were trying to reclaim control over the proceedings. "The prosecution has new evidence to present." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. She motioned for him to continue. Reynolds approached the witness stand, holding a thick stack of papers. He was almost theatrically dramatic as he made his way back to the table. "We've come across a crucial detail that could shift the entire direction of this case. A confidential witness has come forward, someone who claims to have seen James at a different location the night of the murder." A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Was this another attempt to cloud the facts? Or had the prosecution truly uncovered something legitimate? She looked over at Maya, who immediately tensed. James, too, had his hand clenched around the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "We request to call this new witness to the stand," Reynolds continued. Eleanor felt the eyes of the room on her. "Granted, but I want to know more about the witness before we proceed." Reynolds smiled, an edge to his voice. "Of course, Your Honor. We'll have that information for you shortly." While the witness was being prepared, Eleanor had no intention of waiting idly. She had made up her mind that she would dig deeper into Frank Miller's background and try to find the connection between him and the mysterious EL. If the defense didn't find the truth first, she would. There was a risk involved, of course, but Eleanor had never been one to shy away from a fight. She leaned back in her chair, watching the defense team's every move. Maya was having a hushed conversation with James. Both were trying to remain calm, but Eleanor could sense the quiet panic creeping into the air. Something wasn't right. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and a man stepped inside, his face hidden behind a black mask. The room went quiet. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses, his presence somehow unsettling. Eleanor had seen many witnesses come through this courtroom, but none like this. He moved with purpose, and the way he held himself told her that he was someone used to operating in the shadows. Reynolds stood and gestured toward the masked man. "This is our confidential witness, Your Honor. For safety reasons, he will remain anonymous for now." Eleanor's instincts kicked in. There was something about the man's demeanor that sent a chill down her spine. Why the mask? Why the secrecy? "You may proceed," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering despite the unease growing inside her. The witness cleared his throat and then began speaking, his voice low and gravelly. "I know the defendant, James Bellamy. I saw him the night of the murder." A murmur ran through the courtroom. James's face twisted with confusion, and Maya shot a look toward the prosecution, clearly skeptical. "Where did you see him?" Eleanor asked, trying to cut through the fog of uncertainty. The witness leaned forward slightly, though his eyes were still obscured by the sunglasses. "I saw him near a warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't far from where the victim's body was found. I didn't think much of it at first, but when the police came around asking about James, I remembered." Eleanor's heart pounded. This was new information. But why hadn't the prosecution mentioned this before? And why was this witness suddenly so intent on being involved now? She kept her questions controlled, measured. "Can you confirm the time you saw the defendant?" The witness paused for a moment, his voice dropping even lower. "It was around 9:15 p.m. I was walking home from a job when I saw him." Eleanor's mind raced. That was close to the time the murder occurred, but there was still a nagging doubt in her. Something didn't feel right. "What exactly was he doing?" she pressed. "He was talking to someone. I couldn't see their face clearly. It looked like they were exchanging something." The witness's voice was shaking now, and Eleanor could sense the unease beneath the calm exterior. "I didn't stick around long enough to get a good look at what was happening. I just walked away." The courtroom fell silent. Every pair of eyes was on the masked witness, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this testimony. The witness had barely seen anything concrete, and yet he was suddenly a key figure in this trial. As the witness was dismissed, Eleanor turned her attention back to James and Maya. James was pale, visibly rattled by the new developments. Maya, however, was seething, her expression dark as she glared at the prosecution table. "This is getting ridiculous," she whispered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "They're pulling out all the stops now, but they don't have anything solid." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She was thinking, her mind already working on the next move. If the prosecution was willing to throw out such vague testimony, it meant they were grasping at straws. They had to be. But why were they so desperate? She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. She had to know more about this witness. She had to uncover who was really behind the curtain pulling the strings. Back in her chambers, Eleanor turned to her assistant, Sophie. "Get me everything you can on Frank Miller's associates, especially anyone connected to a criminal network in this area. I want names, addresses, connections, everything." Sophie nodded, her fingers already flying over the keyboard. "Right away, Your Honor." Eleanor knew that the pieces were coming together, but they were still out of her reach. Frank Miller's sudden death had been too convenient, and now, with this new mysterious witness, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than a simple courtroom case. She had to act fast. Time was running out. If she didn't uncover the truth soon, it might be too late for everyone involved. As the trial continued into the late afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that the next move could change everything. But Eleanor, despite the storm swirling around her, was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were tense. Eleanor spent hours combing through every scrap of evidence, every file connected to the case. The mystery surrounding Frank Miller's death and the masked witness had deepened, but more troubling was the realization that the prosecution's sudden shift in focus might be more than a desperate attempt to gain the upper hand. There was a calculated precision to their strategy now, a strategy that seemed to be directed by unseen forces. James had become even more elusive, and Maya, though still determined to fight, was clearly struggling with the mounting pressure. Eleanor couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that they were being played by someone far more powerful than they realized. Eleanor sat in her office late one evening, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting shadows on the walls. Sophie entered quietly, holding a thick file in her hands. "I found something, Your Honor. Something you might want to see." Eleanor looked up, her gaze sharpening. "What is it?" Sophie opened the file and slid it across the desk. "It's about Frank Miller's connections. It seems he was in deep with some dangerous people with a lot of influence, and not just in this town. There are links to several high-profile figures, including politicians and business leaders, who could very well be involved in a scheme to cover something up." Eleanor's eyes scanned the pages, taking in the details. It was exactly what she had feared. Frank Miller hadn't just been a simple informant or small-time operator. He had been deeply involved in a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what she had initially imagined. "Do you recognize any of these names?" Eleanor asked, her voice cold. Sophie hesitated, then pointed to one name on the list. "Yes, this one. Marcus Hawk. He's a business tycoon, well known in the city. But his connections go way beyond business. He's been linked to several criminal organizations." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Marcus Hawk. She'd heard his name whispered around the courthouse, but had never connected him to the case, until now. If Hawk was involved, then they were dealing with something much bigger than a murder. Sophie continued, "I also found something interesting. According to the records, Frank Miller was trying to gather evidence against someone very high up. It looks like he was preparing to go public with what he knew about Hawk and other influential figures." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And now he's dead." Sophie nodded grimly. "The timing of his death, it's too convenient." Eleanor knew she couldn't let this slip through her fingers. If Frank Miller had been silenced to protect someone as powerful as Marcus Hawk, then she had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But doing so would be dangerous. She couldn't act without solid evidence, and right now, everything was based on suspicion. She decided to confront the prosecution. If they were indeed in cahoots with these powerful figures, she would need to play her cards carefully. Going public with her suspicions might only make her a target, but confronting them in the courtroom could shake things up. The next morning, she made her way to the courtroom, her mind racing with what she had just learned. As she entered, she caught sight of James and Maya in a corner, discussing quietly. James looked haggard, a far cry from the confident man who had walked in on the first day of the trial. Eleanor approached them, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Maya stood first, her eyes narrowing. "About what?" Eleanor glanced at James before speaking. "About Frank Miller and the people he was involved with. There's a bigger picture here, and it's not just about your trial. If we don't move quickly, we might lose any chance of getting to the truth." James shook his head, frustration and disbelief written all over his face. "What are you talking about? Frank Miller is dead, and now they've got this anonymous witness. What's left to fight for?" Eleanor placed a hand on the table between them, her gaze unwavering. "There's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you realize. Frank was trying to expose someone important, and now we're all in danger." Maya's expression shifted. For the first time, Eleanor saw something like fear flicker in her eyes. "You're saying this is bigger than just a murder trial? That someone wants to make sure no one finds out what really happened?" Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we need to dig deeper. Frank's death wasn't random. He was killed because he knew too much, and now someone is trying to cover it up." James slumped back in his chair, his face pale. "But what can we do? We're up against people who have all the power. We can't fight them alone." "We don't have to fight them alone," Eleanor said, her tone hardening. "But we have to act fast. I'm going to put everything I've got on the table in court today. If I'm right, I'll expose them for what they are, no matter who's pulling the strings." The courtroom was electric as the trial resumed. The atmosphere felt charged, as though everyone knew that something monumental was about to happen. Eleanor could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Reynolds stood, his usual smug expression replaced by something resembling apprehension. "Your Honor, we call our next witness." The door opened, and the masked figure from the day before stepped into the courtroom once more. This time, however, Eleanor was prepared. She stood up and faced the judge. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I request that this witness be unmasked. We have reason to believe that this individual may be linked to an ongoing conspiracy to obstruct justice in this case." The courtroom gasped. Even the defense looked stunned by the boldness of her request. Judge Daniels hesitated, looking between Eleanor and the prosecution. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I'll allow it. Unmask the witness." The room fell silent as the man slowly removed his mask, revealing a face Eleanor had only seen in news reports. The face of Marcus Hawk. The gasp that echoed through the courtroom was deafening. The moment was like something out of a thriller, a twisted turn that no one had expected. Marcus Hawk, the very man Eleanor had been investigating, was standing in front of them, his cold eyes scanning the room with a chilling calmness. Eleanor took a step forward, her voice steady. "Mr. Hawk, I believe the court has some questions for you, and I intend to make sure you answer them." The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. The game had changed. And now, Eleanor would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. The room buzzed with a tense energy as Marcus Hawk stood before the court, his face now fully exposed. The gravity of the moment was impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a murder trial. The stakes had escalated, and Eleanor was in the middle of something far darker than she had ever anticipated. Hawk's presence was a signal that the very foundation of the case had shifted, and now it was her turn to make her move. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Hawk's eyes locked with Eleanor's, his expression unreadable. The gavel slammed down. "Order!" Judge Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the murmur of disbelief that spread through the room. Eleanor stood tall, heart pounding in her chest. There was no turning back now. The pieces were all in place, and Marcus Hawk, the elusive businessman with far-reaching connections, had just become the center of their investigation. "Mr. Hawk," Eleanor began, her voice steady and measured, "it seems there's been some misunderstanding regarding your involvement in this case. We were under the impression you were merely a witness, but the truth is far more complicated, isn't it?" Hawk raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His calm demeanor only made the tension in the room more suffocating. The courtroom waited for him to speak, but Eleanor pressed on. "You see, Mr. Hawk, Frank Miller wasn't just a random informant. He was preparing to expose people involved in a network of corruption, and it seems you were one of those people. So I ask you now, why were you disguised as an anonymous witness? And why does the evidence point directly to your involvement in Mr. Miller's death?" There was a collective gasp from the audience. Even the defense attorneys seemed stunned by her directness. Hawk's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You really have no idea what you're dealing with, do you, Eleanor?" His voice was calm, almost patronizing. "This case, this whole situation, is far beyond your comprehension. You've stepped into a world where the rules you know no longer apply. The people you think are your allies, they've been playing you from the start." Eleanor's mind raced as she processed his words. She'd known something wasn't right, but hearing him admit it so nonchalantly sent a shiver down her spine. She was no longer just fighting for justice for Frank Miller and the victims in this case. She was now a target in a larger game of power and control. "You think you've won," she said, her voice unwavering despite the storm of emotions surging inside her. "But the truth will come out. You can't hide behind your money, your connections, or your lies forever." Hawk's expression shifted for a moment, the smile fading as his eyes narrowed. "You really don't get it? I'm not the one who needs to hide. You are." He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, I demand that these baseless accusations be stricken from the record. Ms. Bennett is clearly overstepping her bounds, making wild claims based on nothing more than paranoia. The court is wasting valuable time." The judge hesitated. It was clear that even he was now questioning whether he had misjudged the gravity of this situation. The power in the room was palpable, and though Eleanor had made a bold move, she was keenly aware of the dangerous forces aligning against her. But she wasn't backing down. "Your Honor, I request that we halt these proceedings until further investigation into Mr. Hawk's involvement can be conducted. There is too much at stake, and the integrity of this trial has already been compromised." The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of Eleanor's request hanging in the air. But before anyone could respond, Sophie burst into the courtroom, carrying a stack of documents. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and urgency. "Your Honor," Sophie said, stepping forward with a file in hand, "I have new evidence. I've just received confirmation from several reliable sources that Marcus Hawk was directly involved in a cover-up operation regarding Frank Miller's death." This wasn't just a case of someone trying to silence a witness. This was orchestrated to protect something much bigger, a network of corruption that stretches all the way to the highest levels of government and business. The room erupted in chaos as murmurs rippled through the gallery. Hawk's face twisted in fury, but it was clear he hadn't expected this turn of events. Eleanor seized the moment. "You see, Mr. Hawk, your web is unraveling. We have the evidence now. Your ties to Frank Miller's murder and your involvement in a much larger conspiracy are no longer hidden. You're cornered." Hawk looked around, realizing that the walls were closing in on him. For the first time, the smug arrogance that had defined him started to slip away. But before he could respond, the courtroom door flew open. James walked in with a serious and determined demeanor. He stood at the back of the courtroom, looking every bit the reluctant hero. Eleanor met his gaze, and for a split second, it seemed as if the room had frozen in time. James stepped forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've had enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "I can't sit back and let this go on any longer. I was part of this too. I knew about the cover-up. I knew what Hawk and his associates were involved in." The gasps from the audience were immediate. Eleanor felt a rush of disbelief and understanding all at once. James had been holding a secret this entire time, a secret that could now bring down everything. His confession wasn't just a bombshell, it was the detonator that could destroy everything they had built up until now. "I couldn't speak out before," James continued, his eyes locked on Hawk. "But now I will. It's time for the truth." Hawk's face went ashen. The smugness, the control, it all evaporated in an instant. He wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. The tide had turned, and now it was Eleanor's turn to lead. With James's unexpected confession and Sophie's bombshell evidence, Eleanor knew the case was finally in her hands. The battle wasn't over, but the playing field had changed. For the first time in this trial, Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were falling into place. The people who thought they could silence the truth had underestimated her resolve. And now, their empire of lies was crumbling. Marcus Hawk, the man who had been at the center of it all, was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. He had been exposed, his power unraveled, and soon his entire network would follow. Eleanor wasn't finished yet, but she had just won the battle. The war, however, was far from over. The courtroom, once filled with uncertainty, now buzzed with anticipation. This was it, the moment that would change everything. And as the final gavel fell, Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.